The machines were keeping me alive. Beep, beep, beep. That steady rhythm was all that separated me from whatever came next. Tubes ran into my arms, my chest was wrapped tight, and my lungs felt like they belonged to someone else. I'd survived a heart attack that should have killed me, and now I was trapped here in this ICU bed, listening to my own body betray me one breath at a time. But it was the sound from the hallway that made my blood run cold. Laughter. Real laughter. The kind you hear at celebrations, at parties, at funerals. Champagne glasses clinking together like they were toasting to something worth celebrating. And underneath it all, I heard her voice, Clarissa's voice, sharp and proud like a victory bell ringing through my own home. My wife sat next to me, holding my hand. Margaret hadn't left my side since they pulled me back from the edge, but something shifted in her face when she heard that noise. Her jaw tightened. Her grip loosened. She knew what it meant. The nurse came in around 11 that night, checking my vitals like she did every hour. When she walked back out, I heard her whisper to someone in the hallway, something that made my heart monitor spike faster than my actual heart could beat. She came back in with this look on her face, the kind people get when they're deciding whether to tell you something that'll destroy you. "Your family's celebrating, Mr. Bainbridge," she finally said, her voice small and careful. "They've got quite the party going on downstairs. Maybe they got some good news." Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. I didn't answer her. I couldn't. My throat felt like someone had poured cement down it. I'd been lying in this hospital bed for 3 weeks, hooked to machines that went beep beep beep, and my family was downstairs with champagne glasses, toasting something. But what? What was worth celebrating when Clifford Bainbridge was upstairs fighting for every single breath? Then Margaret leaned over and whispered something that made everything worse. "They think you're gone, Cliff," she said, tears running down her face. "They think this is the end." She was right. I knew it without being told. That celebration downstairs wasn't for good news about the company or some promotion Evan had gotten. It was a farewell party. For me. My family was celebrating my death while I was still breathing. The next morning, my old business partner Gideon Price walked into my room, and the color had completely drained from his face. He sat in the chair next to my bed, didn't even say hello, just looked at me with this expression like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. "Cliff," he said quietly, "do you know what's happening at your house?" I felt my stomach drop. "Clarissa threw a party. At your mansion. A real celebration." He paused, struggling. "They had a banner. It said, 'To the next chapter, the Bainbridge legacy lives on.'" My hands started shaking under that hospital blanket. They were toasting to my legacy while I was still alive, and that's when I realized something that changed everything. They had no idea what was coming. I came from nothing. The kind of nothing that shapes you, breaks you, or builds you into something harder than you ever thought possible. My father worked the docks, came home smelling like sweat and whiskey, and turned that anger into his fists. My mother prayed every night while we sat in a house held together by duct tape and hope. Winter meant freezing because we couldn't afford heat. Summer meant eating whatever was cheap and didn't go bad too fast. By 16, I was done waiting for somebody else to change my life. I started working construction, learning how to frame walls and lay foundations. I watched the skilled guys, mimicked their movements, asked questions nobody wanted to answer. But I didn't stop asking. Every single day, I went to work with blistered hands and a brain that wouldn't shut up, always thinking about how to do things better, faster, smarter. By the time I was 35, I had my contractor's license and enough saved to start my own business. Bainbridge Homes wasn't born from luck or inheritance. It was built from refusing to accept that I had to stay poor because I was born poor. One house at a time, then 2, then 5, then 50, then 400. Margaret came into my life when I was just getting started. She was working as a receptionist at a materials supply company, and I walked in needing quotes on lumber. She had this way of looking at you like she could see who you actually wanted to be underneath everything else. We got married in a courthouse with 2 witnesses I barely knew. We had Evan 4 years later. Everything I did was for him. I built Bainbridge Homes not to get rich. I built it so my son would never have to patch his shoes with cardboard. So he'd never go to bed hungry. So he'd never watch his father drink away his rage, or his mother pray for days that never got better. I wanted to give him the one thing I never had, a real foundation. But somewhere along the way, having everything became expecting everything. Having options became feeling entitled to more options. And having a father who'd built an empire became thinking that empire was already his to spend. By the time I turned 60, I'd built a $5 million empire spread across properties, stocks, and cash. I'd earned every penny through decades of work that left me weathered like old wood. The company was running smooth, the money was solid, and I was ready to step back. That's when I should have been at peace. That's when everything should have felt like it meant something. But Evan wasn't proud of what I'd built. He was impatient to inherit it. I noticed it first in his questions. Dad, when are you planning to slow down? Translation: when can I take over? Then came the requests. Not asks. Requests. I need an advance on my inheritance, Dad. I want to invest in real estate with some friends. Every time he said it, his wife Clarissa would be standing just behind him, that perfect smile on her face, not saying anything. Just watching. Margaret warned me about her from the beginning. We'd be sitting at the dinner table, and Margaret would give me that look, the one that said, "You're being played and you don't even know it." But when you're a man who's spent his whole life building things, it's hard to believe anybody would come into your family to tear it down. That should have been my first clue. But I didn't listen. Clarissa walked into our lives like she was arriving at a red carpet event. Evan brought her home 8 years ago, and from the moment she stepped through the door, everything changed. She had dark hair, sharp eyes that seemed to calculate everything they landed on, and a smile that could make you believe she genuinely cared about you. That smile was dangerous because it almost worked. She brought wine to Margaret and asked about her garden. She told me stories about her parents that had just enough sadness in them to make her seem vulnerable. She laughed at Evan's jokes like they were the funniest things she'd ever heard. She was perfect in that way that made you wonder when you were going to see the cracks. Margaret saw the cracks first. One afternoon, Margaret was sitting with her while I was at the office. When I came home, Margaret pulled me into the kitchen and whispered, "Her compliments aren't real, Cliff. They're like she's studying us. Like we're a map and she's figuring out where the money is." I told her she was being paranoid. Nobody comes into a family planning to hurt it. That's not how people work. That's not how love works. But Margaret just shook her head and said, "Her eyes aren't on Evan. They're on your empire." I didn't believe her then. I wish I had. Over the next few years, I watched my son transform into someone I didn't recognize. The ambition I used to admire became arrogance. The work ethic disappeared and got replaced with entitlement. He started showing up late to company meetings, leaving early, asking why he wasn't vice president yet when he hadn't put in the work to earn it. And Clarissa was always there, whispering in his ear. Not obviously. Never obviously. Just little things. "Your father doesn't really appreciate what you could do for the business, Evan." Or, in normal families, the son takes over by now. Or my personal favorite, the time she said it right in front of me, "You're too talented to work under someone else. Even if it is your father." He was putty in her hands. The worst part was watching it happen and feeling powerless to stop it. You raise a man from birth, you teach him right from wrong, you show him how to work and build and create something real. And then you watch someone else come in and undo it all with pretty words and calculated kindness. One night at dinner, he said it straight out. "You can't take it with you, Dad. Might as well let me enjoy it while you're still around." He laughed like it was a joke, but Clarissa just smiled into her wineglass like she was already spending my money. That's when I knew. That's when I finally understood what Margaret had been trying to tell me all along. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were planning for it. And they were tired of waiting. Chapter 4. I felt the pain first in my left arm. Sharp, radiating, spreading across my chest like wildfire. I was in my office, going over quarterly reports, when my body just decided it was done cooperating. I grabbed the edge of my desk, and everything went quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before everything falls apart. They said later I was lucky. The paramedics got there in time. My heart didn't stop completely. They got me to the hospital before permanent damage set in. But lying there in that ICU, hooked to machines, breathing through tubes, I didn't feel lucky. I felt like my body was trying to tell me something my mind had been refusing to hear. The first week was bad. The second week was worse. By the third week, I was starting to think clearly again, and that's when I heard them. It was late at night, maybe 2 in the morning. The nurses had given me something to help me sleep, but it wasn't working the way it was supposed to. I was drifting in and out, caught between consciousness and whatever dreams my drugged brain could conjure up. That's when I heard the voices in the hallway outside my room. Laughter first. Then clinking glasses. Then Clarissa's voice cutting through everything else with that sharp, satisfied tone she used when she'd just won something. "To Evan," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "To finally getting what should have been yours all along." I forced my eyes open. My heart monitor started going crazy. Beep, 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 like it was trying to warn me about something. A nurse rushed in, checked my vitals, but by then the voices were gone. By then I was alone with what I'd heard and the horrible knowledge that it had been real. The next morning, Evan and Clarissa came to visit. Evan tried to look concerned, but his eyes were on my machines, on my face, calculating something. Clarissa wore a silk dress like she was heading to brunch, and her lipstick was the kind of red that says she felt good about something. "How are you feeling, Dad?" Evan asked, and I could hear the impatience underneath the words. The same impatience I'd been hearing for years. Clarissa stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot like she was already thinking about something else. When I didn't answer right away, she turned back to me with that smile. "The doctors say you're stable," she said. "That's good news, right?" But her eyes told a different story. They weren't relieved. They weren't happy to see me recovering. They were disappointed. And that's when I realized what my family had been waiting for. Not for me to get better. Not for me to recover and come home and get back to normal. They were waiting for me to die. They were already planning the funeral, dividing up the money in their heads, toasting to their futures. I looked at my son, the boy I'd built everything for, and I understood that Margaret had been right all along. My family wasn't just greedy. They were predators. And I was bleeding. Gideon Price had been my business partner for 23 years. We'd built Bainbridge Homes together from the ground up. When he walked into my ICU room 3 days later, I could tell from his face that he was carrying something heavy that couldn't stay hidden anymore. He pulled up a chair and sat down without saying hello. Just sat there for a solid minute, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the armrests like he was trying to keep himself from exploding. "Cliff, I need to tell you something," he finally said. "And I need you to promise you're not going to shoot the messenger." I'd never heard Gideon sound like that. Not in 23 years. Not even when we almost lost everything in 2008. My stomach tightened. "I drove by your house last night. Around 8 o'clock. I was going to stop by and drop off some documents, but when I got there, I could hear music from the street. Laughter. A lot of people. He paused, and I could see him wrestling with whether to continue. I called Evan to ask what was going on. He told me it was just a family dinner. But it wasn't, I said. It wasn't a question. Gideon shook his head. I went to the gate anyway. Your house was lit up like New Year's Eve, Cliff. There were cars parked down the entire block. Catering vans. Bartenders. String lights in the garden. They had a banner hung across the dining room window. I read it myself. To the next chapter, the Bainbridge legacy lives on. The room started spinning. Or maybe I was starting to understand, and the spinning was just the feeling of my world shifting. They were toasting, Gideon continued, his voice getting quieter. I heard it through the window. Your son was bragging about finally taking over Bainbridge Homes. Talking about ideas he had, people he'd fire, how things were going to be different now. And Clarissa, Cliff, she was toasting to you. Toasting to the man who's been like a father to me. Toasting to his death like it was a foregone conclusion. Margaret squeezed my hand so hard I thought she might break it. They even had champagne served in special glasses, Gideon said. Like it was an official event. Your son was already measuring the office for new furniture, Cliff. Already talking about bringing in his own people. They didn't just think you were dying. They'd already buried you and started dividing your grave. I couldn't speak. My throat felt like someone had put a fist through it. For 3 weeks I'd been lying in this bed, fighting to stay alive, doing everything the doctors told me to do. And my family had been downstairs celebrating the end of me like it was a party worth planning. Gideon stood up to leave, but before he did, he looked at me and said something that changed everything. You've got one choice now, Cliff. You can let them win, or you can get out of that bed and remind them why they should have never counted you out. He left, and the door clicked shut behind him. I looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at me. And right then, lying flat on my back in a hospital bed with tubes running through my arms, I started planning my revenge. But it wasn't going to be loud. It wasn't going to be angry. It was going to be quiet. The morning after Gideon left, I asked my nurse to call someone. Not another family member. Not my doctor. I needed Harlan Mendez, my attorney. The man I'd trusted with every legal decision I'd ever made. The man who knew exactly what I was about to do. Harlan walked into my ICU room 2 hours later looking confused. He'd known me for 30 years. He knew when something was business and when something was personal. This was both. I thought you were in no condition for meetings, he said, settling into the chair next to my bed. His briefcase sat heavy on his lap like it was carrying weight beyond just papers. I'm not, I told him. I'm in perfect condition for what I need to do. I told him everything. The party, the banner, the toasting to my death, the impatience in my son's eyes, the calculation in Clarissa's smile. I told him about the business I'd built, the legacy I'd wanted to leave, and how my family had already started spending my corpse like I was already in the ground. Harlan listened without interrupting. That was one of the things I respected about him. He didn't judge. He just listened and thought and understood. When I finished, I said 6 words that changed everything. We're rewriting the entire estate plan. Harlan didn't react with shock or hesitation. He just opened his briefcase and pulled out his legal pad. Tell me what you want to accomplish, he said. I spent the next 3 hours dictating my new will between doctor visits and 4 changes. I was still recovering from a heart attack. I was still attached to machines. But my mind was clearer than it had been in years. The strategy was simple. I didn't want to cut Evan out completely. That would have been too easy, too too obvious. I wanted him to earn what he thought he already owned. I wanted consequences that lasted longer than a day. I wanted justice that made him think about his choices every single morning for the rest of his life. For Clarissa, I had something different in mind. Something that would destroy her plans but leave her guessing about exactly what I knew and when I'd figured it out. And for Elena, my 5-year-old granddaughter, the only person in that house who still looked at me with love instead of expectation, I had something that would protect her future and remind my family what actually mattered. By the time Harlan left my room, the new will was outlined. The strategy was set. The trap was built. All I had to do now was wait for my family to show their true faces one more time, and then I'd spring it. Harlan paused at the door and turned back to me. His eyes had changed. They looked almost proud. "You're not dying, Cliff," he said quietly. "You're planning your resurrection." He left, and I lay back against my pillow. My heart monitor beeped steady and strong. For the first time since I'd woken up in this ICU, I felt like I could actually breathe. The waiting was almost over. The new will took 3 days to finalize. 3 days of dictating between pain medication and physical therapy. 3 days of making sure every word was legally airtight, every clause was exactly what I wanted, and every consequence was impossible to escape from. I didn't tell Margaret what I was doing. She knew something was happening. She could see it in the way I'd changed, in the way my eyes weren't clouded anymore. But I wanted her to genuinely be surprised when it all came out. That way, when people questioned whether I was making this decision under duress or out of temporary anger, Margaret could honestly say she didn't know what was coming either. Harlan brought the finalized documents on the 4th day. Thick folders. Legal language that had been refined and polished and reviewed by 3 different lawyers to make sure there were no loopholes my son could exploit. No way for Clarissa to challenge it. No escape routes. I read through every page. Every single one. For Evan, I'd created a trust. A carefully constructed trap disguised as an opportunity. He would get access to the business, the thing he wanted most. But there was a condition. He had to run Bainbridge Homes for 5 consecutive years. 5 full years. Profitably. Without selling off any company assets. Without taking excessive personal draws. Without destroying the company that my employees had helped me build. If he succeeded, after those 5 years, he'd get control of a portion of my liquid assets. Enough to live on comfortably. Enough to matter. But if he failed, if he ran the company into the ground, if he sold it off piece by piece, if he put his own interests ahead of the business, everything reverted to the employee profit-sharing fund. The people who'd actually built this empire would be rewarded. My greedy son would get nothing. For Clarissa, I created something more surgical. A sealed envelope. To be opened only after my death. Inside that envelope was a letter. Not a confession. Not accusations. Just a letter that would tell her exactly what I knew about her plans, and exactly how little of my fortune she'd actually receive. 1 envelope. 1 letter. That was all. The real power was in the unknown. She'd spend years wondering what that letter said. She'd lie awake at night imagining what I'd discovered. She'd never know if I saw the party or overheard conversations, or if Gideon had told me. The uncertainty would eat her alive faster than any courtroom battle ever could. And then there was Elena. I left her the heart of my fortune. Not because she was my favorite, though at 5 years old she was the only one who loved me unconditionally, but because she represented something my family had lost. She represented the future without greed. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was still someone in my bloodline who could inherit something and not destroy it immediately. I signed every page with a steady hand. Each signature felt like sealing their fates. Not with anger. With precision. When Harlan watched me sign the last page, he smiled. "This is poetry," he said simply. "This is justice that teaches a lesson instead of just destroying people." "That's the whole point," I told him. "I don't want to destroy them. I want to change them. I want them to wake up every morning for the rest of their lives knowing they chose greed over gratitude, and knowing exactly what it cost them." Harlan closed his briefcase. "Don't file it yet," I instructed. "Not until they show their true faces one more time. I want to be absolutely certain." "And if they do?" he asked. "Then we execute this plan and let God sort out the consequences." He nodded and left me alone with my revenge, which at that moment felt less like vengeance and more like the most honest thing I'd ever done. 2 weeks later, I was still in the ICU, but my body was mending. The doctors said I could probably go home in another week. That's when Evan and Clarissa came to visit again. It was late afternoon, visiting hours winding down, and most of the other patients had their families around them. They walked in like they owned the place. Evan was in an expensive suit, paid for by my money, I'm sure. Clarissa wore designer clothes and carrying a bag that probably cost more than most people's cars. She had this energy about her like she was already planning where she'd redecorate when she inherited the house. "Dad," Evan said, pulling up a chair. "How are you feeling?" His eyes betrayed him. They weren't asking because he cared. They were asking because every day I spent alive was a day he couldn't access the money. Every day I was in the hospital was money being spent on my care instead of being available for him to inherit. "Better," I told him. "Doctors think I can go home soon." Clarissa smiled that smile. The one that was all teeth and no warmth. "That's wonderful news. You must be so relieved." "You must be too," I said quietly. She froze. Just for a second. Just long enough that I knew she understood exactly what I meant. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice changing, the sweetness draining out of it. "I mean," I said slowly, "that I heard about the party, the banner, the toasting." Evan's face went white. Clarissa's jaw clenched. "We were just celebrating," Evan stammered. "Just some friends over. Nothing serious." "You were celebrating my death," I said. "Not angry. Just factual. While I was upstairs fighting for every breath, you were downstairs planning how you'd spend my money." Clarissa stood up. "You're misunderstanding." "I'm not misunderstanding anything," I interrupted. "I understand perfectly. And I've been taking care of things too." "What do you mean, taking care of things?" Evan asked. He looked sick. He looked like he already knew. I smiled. Not a happy smile. A smile that said everything was about to change and there was nothing they could do to stop it. "You'll find out soon enough," I told him. "But I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember standing in this hospital room, thinking you'd already won. Because you haven't. Not yet." Clarissa grabbed her purse. "Come on, Evan. Let's go." But before they left, I said one more thing. "Tell me something. When you were toasting to my death, did it feel good? Did it feel like victory?" They didn't answer. They just left. Margaret squeezed my hand so hard her nails left marks on my skin. "Now," she whispered. "Now," I confirmed. I picked up the phone and called Harlan. It was time to file the new will. It was time for the waiting to end and the reckoning to begin. 1 week later, I walked out of the hospital. My doctors said I needed to take it easy, but my legs remembered how to work. My lungs remembered how to breathe without help. And my mind remembered exactly what I needed to do. The car ride home felt like driving toward a battlefield. Margaret sat next to me, quiet, her hand resting on my arm. She knew what was waiting for us at the house. She knew that by tomorrow morning, everything was going to change. When we pulled into the driveway, Clarissa was standing on the front porch like she owned it. Like she'd already claimed her territory. She watched us get out of the car, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. "Oh, we didn't expect you back so soon," she said, her voice stretched thin. "I can see that," I replied, walking past her into the house. The party decorations were still up, still hanging in the dining room like trophies of their betrayal. "I can see a lot of things now." I called for a family meeting that night. Evan came down from upstairs looking nervous. Clarissa kept checking her phone like she was waiting for an escape route. Margaret sat next to me on the couch, solid as a rock. "Harlan's coming tomorrow morning," I announced. "We're going to read my will. All of it." "Your will?" Clarissa asked, and I could hear the panic in her voice now. "What do you mean? What have you done?" I didn't answer. I just looked at her and smiled. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow you find out what comes next." That night, lying in my own bed for the first time in 3 weeks, I felt something shift in my chest. Not pain. Not the kind that makes your heart stop. It was relief. It was the feeling of finally laying down a burden that had been crushing me. I'd survived the heart attack. I'd recovered from the betrayal. Now came the part that would last forever, the reckoning. Harlan arrived at 9 in the morning with his briefcase. The same briefcase he'd brought to the hospital. The same one that now held the future of my entire family. We sat in the living room. Me in my chair. Margaret beside me. Evan shifting nervously on the couch. Clarissa standing by the window like she was already planning her escape. "Before we begin," Harlan said, his voice carrying the weight of every word, "Mr. Bainbridge has requested I read a letter aloud." He pulled out a white envelope. My handwriting was on the front. Not addressed to anyone specific. Just waiting to be opened. "Go ahead," I told him. Harlan broke the seal and began to read my words. "To my beloved family, those who toasted to my death before I was buried, I leave one final toast in return, to humility, to consequence, and to the truth that love cannot be inherited. Only earned." Clarissa's face went pale. Evan looked like he might throw up. Then Harlan read the terms. The conditions. The trust that required 5 years of profitable management. The consequences if Evan failed. The employee fund that would inherit everything if he did. The sealed envelope for Clarissa that would be opened only after I died, leaving her to wonder for however many years I had left what I knew and what she was losing. And then he read about Elena, the majority of liquid assets, the properties held in trust, the fund that would take care of her education, her future, everything. The room went completely silent. "You can't do this," Clarissa finally shouted, her voice shrill. "You can't punish us like this." I stood up slowly. My legs were still weak, but my voice was strong. Stronger than it had been in years. "I didn't punish you, Clarissa," I said calmly. "You punished yourselves when you decided to celebrate before the ending was written. When you threw a party for my death and thought I was too weak to hear it. When you looked at me lying in a hospital bed and saw nothing but money waiting to be spent." Evan had his head in his hands. "You have 5 years," I told him. 5 years to prove you're actually worthy of what you thought was already yours. 5 years to show me you inherited something from me besides my DNA. That clock starts now." Clarissa moved toward Harlan like she was going to grab the documents. "The sealed envelope stays sealed," Harlan said, holding it up. "Until Mr. Bainbridge's passing. That's the will of the testator, and it's legally binding." She looked at me then, and I saw everything. I saw the fear, the anger, the realization that her plan had failed, that the gravy train had stopped. that she was going to have to actually work for anything she wanted now. "We're leaving," she hissed, grabbing Evan's arm. "You can leave whenever you want," I said. "But understand this, if you leave, you forfeit the trust. Evan loses access to the business. Everything goes to the employees. The choice is yours. Stay and prove yourselves, or go and lose everything you wanted." They stood there for a long moment. I watched them calculate their options. I watched them realize they were trapped, not by locks or chains, but by their own greed. "We'll stay," Evan finally said quietly. "We'll prove it." But he said it the way someone says they'll accept a life sentence, with the full knowledge that every day was going to be harder than they'd ever imagined. That night, alone in my office, I poured myself a drink I probably shouldn't have had given my heart condition. But I didn't care. I'd waited weeks for this moment, and it was everything I'd hoped it would be. Margaret found me there, staring at my reflection in the glass. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like I'm finally the one breathing free," I told her. 3 weeks later, Evan showed up at Bainbridge Homes. For the first time in months, he actually came to work. He spent that first day sitting in the office I'd built, looking at the company I'd created, and I think for the first time in his life, he understood what it actually meant. It wasn't just money on a paper. It was people. It was legacy. It was the sum total of decades of work and sacrifice and choices made right when everyone around you was telling you to take shortcuts. Clarissa didn't leave, but she changed. Not because she became a good person. People like that don't change in fundamental ways. But she became aware. Aware that I was watching. Aware that her every move was being calculated against the 5-year timer. Aware that the money she'd been planning to spend was no longer guaranteed to be there. That's a different kind of punishment than jail time or lawsuits. It's the slow realization that your plan failed. That your victim survived. That everything you'd planned for was now in question. Margaret and I settled back into the rhythm of life. I took my medications. I did my physical therapy. I rebuilt my strength one day at a time. But the real healing happened on Saturday mornings when Elena came to visit. She'd skip into my office with her crayon drawings and her bright smile, the only person in my family who loved me simply for being me instead of for what I could give her. "Grandpa," she said one morning, spreading out her latest creation, "I drew you a house." It was a simple drawing. Crooked lines and bright colors and a sun in the corner. But it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. "It's perfect," I told her. "Do you know why?" She shook her head. "Because it's built on love instead of greed. That makes it worth more than all the real houses in the world." She smiled at me like she understood exactly what I meant, even though she was too young to fully comprehend it. Maybe that's what legacy actually means. Not the money you leave behind. Not the empire you built. But the values you pass on to the ones who still know how to love without calculating the return on investment. 3 months into Evan's 5-year trial, Bainbridge Homes posted its best quarterly numbers in 5 years. He was actually working. Actually managing. Actually proving that somewhere underneath all that entitlement, there was still a work ethic he'd inherited from me. I never told him whether I was proud. Pride is its own reward, and right now, the only thing my son needed was the understanding that nothing was guaranteed. That everything he thought was his was actually something he had to earn every single day. The doctors told me my heart was stabilizing. That with proper medication and care, I could have years left. Maybe decades if I was lucky. And every single year, I'd be here watching my son live with the consequences of his choices. Every year, I'd be here to see if Clarissa lasted or if she finally ran out of patience with a life that wasn't going to make her rich. And every Saturday morning, Elena would draw me another house, and I'd remember why I'd built everything in the first place. They thought my silence in that ICU bed was weakness. They thought a man who was lying on his back, breathing through tubes, was someone they could count out. They thought they'd already won. But silence isn't weakness. Silence is the patience of a man who's learned that revenge tastes better cold. Silence is the strategy of someone who understands that the best punishment isn't destruction. It's consequence. It's accountability. It's the slow realization that your victim didn't actually die. He just woke up. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you loved, if you've ever felt that moment when you realized the people closest to you were working against you instead of for you, hit that like button. You're not alone. Your story matters. Your journey matters. And somewhere out there, someone just like you is dealing with the exact same thing. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Because there are more people out there fighting battles you'll never know about. More families dealing with betrayal you can't imagine. More stories of triumph and justice that remind us all why we keep fighting. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us your story. Inspire others who might be reading and thinking they're the only ones going through this. Because community heals. Truth connects us. And knowing you're not alone in your pain changes everything. This is Clifford Bainbridge. And this is my story.